Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast today is Clark Datchler. Now, Clark will be a recognisable face as the frontman for Johnny Hates Jazz, who had a huge success in the 80s. Johnny, Clark, it's wonderful to welcome you to the Godcast. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, Alex. Don't worry. A lot of people call me Johnny, even to this day. I'm very used to it.
Whereabouts in the world are you today?
Well, I'm actually in the village where I grew up, which is in Surrey, and I'm here because I've moved in with my mom, who's 94 years old, to look after her in her later years, which she does need some support. And I'm actually in the room. I've set up my studio in the room where I wrote the original Johnny Hates Jazz hits. So it's kind of a really interesting full circle journey to be here again, working on new material, but just looking over there at the piano, which you can't see obviously, the piano where I wrote Shattered Dreams and Turn Back the Clock, and so it's a vibey space. It's kind of a good thing to do. Good thing to do.
Have you moved far away from Surrey before that?
Yeah, I lived in Holland for a while. I lived in Bath for many years, and I lived in the US for about 10 years. I was in California and then Arizona, in the high mountain desert of Arizona, which I loved, actually. I loved the fact that I'm very land oriented, and I loved the fact that the Southwest, the desert Southwest, was so different for me. It wasn't alien at all. I fell in love with it very quickly, but it's not what we're used to here, you know, which is, you know, for want of a better phrase, very lush. You know, it's very, very green here, but I loved it there. So yeah, I've traveled quite a ways, and ironic that I'm back in this little village in Ashford.
And you talk about your studio. You've recently finished recording, is that right? New stuff?
Well, we did Johnny Hates Jazz put out an album actually during lockdown, during the first lockdown. So we had worked right up until lockdown, not knowing what was about to come, of course. We just thought we were going to release an album as normal. And then when lockdown happened, we obviously had to make a decision. You know, everyone in the business was saying, oh, wait until 2021, January 2021, or September 2020 was actually the first date that everyone was saying. And we were just thinking, well, you know, yeah, maybe, but it could be longer than that. And also, it is a very hopeful, positive album. It's called Wide Awake. And we just thought the right thing is to put it out now. You know, if people need to hear positive music at any time in their lives, it's now. So that was the last album that we did as a band. Yeah.
And I suppose the intention would have been to tour that album as well, but have you managed to do many live dates this year?
We recently did some live dates with Level 42. Actually, it was both of us on tour together, and that was the first time we could play any of the songs from that album, Wide Awake. So to all intents and purposes, for all of those audience, it was a brand new album. They didn't know that it came out in whatever it was, April 2020, and that's kind of an irony of the pandemic as a musician, in as much as everything went into suspended animation for a while, and we start to come out of it, and it literally is as if we've started at the beginning of 2020. So yeah, we played live. It was fantastic. Audiences were great. We were up your way, actually. We weren't actually in Burnley. We were in Manchester, and I always gravitate to the north if I can. I love it up there. I love the people. I love the land. There's something about the history of the land that really calls to me, and so whenever we're up there, it's a relief.
It's a special place. Manchester is a fantastic city. Clark, I was going to ask you. You just said about your new material. Is your fan base receptive to new material? I was talking to Chris Difford from Squeeze about this, and he's a big fan of Elvis Costello, and he said, you know, if I just want to hear the hits. You know, when I go see Elvis Costello, I just want to hear the hits. How do you find that with your audience? Are they hungry for new stuff, or or are they just pining for the old stuff?
It's a bit of both. And the interesting thing is that it really does come down to how good your new stuff is, because audiences are discerning. I don't think that audiences go around completely blinkered and saying, I just want to hear the hits, I don't want to hear any of the new stuff. I do. I mean, I have a chuckle when I announce a new track, because I know how mostly we all kind of take that. It's like, you know, let's get to the next one that we recognize. What was fortunate for us was that the albums we've done since the 80s, in particular Magnetize, which was 2013, and Wide Awake, the new one, they're, in my humble opinion, they're really good albums. They hold up well to the 80s stuff, and they go down incredibly well. We had a lot of people come up to us afterwards and say how much they enjoyed the new material, and they were surprised that they did, because it's true that, you know, it's hard to maintain a certain level. If you've done well at a certain point in your life, it's very hard to keep the bar as a songwriter high. But I think we've done pretty good. So yeah, I tell you what, Alex, let me just say this at the risk of waffling a bit. One thing that I do is I always talk about the reasons behind certain songs being written. What are the lyrics about? And as I've gone through life, you know, my lyrics have become much more socially oriented. So the new album, Wide Awake, has a lot of social orientation and commentary, and people respond to that. They really like to hear that. They come up to me afterwards and say, you know what you said about that song, and the dangers of, for example, the title track, Wide Awake, is about the dangers of inhabiting the world of social media and streaming and the digital world in general, so much that you lose touch with the real world, and especially with Mother Nature. And here we are in this terrible predicament with how we've treated the planet. That speaks to them. And I think that says a lot about an audience, that an audience is made up of individuals who've had their own life journeys, and they care about these things too. They're worried for their kids too. So that to me is very important, is to communicate on multiple levels about why a song should even exist.
Yeah, yeah. And you've kind of always been in a kind of a musical family, Clark, haven't you? I was looking, and people would be interested to know that your dad was a successful musician and artist. Just tell us about what it was like growing up in such a musical environment.
Yeah, my dad was a professional jazz musician, very successful. He was in two bands, the Stargazers and the Polka Dots, in the 50s. And the Stargazers were big radio stars. They had their own BBC radio show. And they were the first British band to have a #1 hit on the UK chart. My dad was incredibly supportive of me. Once he got over the fact that the band that I had become part of was called Johnny Hates Jazz, which took him about a month. Once he got over that, he was so supportive, and a really lovely person. But I have to say, what was interesting was that, you know, I was growing up listening to the Beatles and the Moody Blues and Led Zeppelin and Stevie Wonder and that whole revolution of music. But really, the Beatles had put the jazz world out of business. So my early years of knowing my dad was seeing him dealing with that. You know, we would have debates about the quality of the Beatles, an example. And he sang on one of the Beatles records. He sang on "I Am the Walrus."
Wow.
But there was pain there. You know, he eventually did accept that they were really fine songwriters, but he didn't like the fact that a whole genre of music was practically trashed in the process, unfairly so. And unfortunately, this seems to happen when new waves of music emerge. There's some concerted effort to undermine what has gone before, and it's not necessary. All these different genres and time periods of music can live side by side. So yeah, that's what it was like.
Yeah, Clark, my dad was a jazz pianist, and not as successful as your own father, but he loved. We grew. He spent a lot of time in London and enjoyed being in Ronnie Scott's jazz club, and he he would try and indoctrinate me with the likes of Cleo Lane and Petula Clark and all these people. And I think I just put up a natural resistance. But I've actually come to the conclusion jazz is not my favourite genre. But how was it for you? Did you warm to the jazz genre, or did you find it all a bit noisy?
Some of it I warmed to, some of it I didn't. I mean, my dad sang regularly on the Petula Clark TV show, so I kind of knew her music well. And she was quite crossover, you know, she was quite progressive, really. Cleo Lane was not my dad's kind of thing. He felt she was a classical singer who was giving it a go at jazz and was a bit straight. But I think that I didn't get, what I was put off by was freeform jazz, which my dad was into, as well as the classic stuff. I really loved Nat King Cole. He's still my favorite singer. And I love listening to Count Basie and Duke Ellington. And in a way that did inform part of my musical worldview. But it's not my favorite genre, I think. It's not. It's just, but I'm a great believer in lineage, and none of the music that I ended up truly loving could have existed without jazz having its day. Yeah, so I respect it very much for that.
And you mentioned your beloved mum there, who you're caring for. Was she a musical influence, or did she participate in music as well, or was it just your father?
It was mostly my father, I think my mom actually had me and my two brothers earmarked for very different professions as well. She knew that music was precarious, so she was a bit worried from that standpoint. But no, it was mainly my dad. And although he didn't really understand what I got into, because when the 80s happened and I quickly adopted electronic music. I mean, I really got into synths, as we all did. And he didn't really understand it. What he understood, though, was the effort put into songwriting that still happened in the 80s, you know, because we were all kids of the 70s and 60s. So those artists of the 70s and 60s taught us how to write songs. So you get to the 80s and you've got this amazing combination of classical songwriting with technology. And that won't happen again. It was only going to happen in that period of time, because now technology is everywhere you look, and songwriting is not what it used to be. How it happens is very different now. So he appreciated that, and he really, I mean, he was the first person to hear my first hit, Shattered Dreams, and the first person to say it was going to be a hit. And there were many people in the music industry who thought it was going to be a complete failure. So I've never forgotten that. You know, even though he didn't quite get the musical form, he understood quality of songwriting.
You just kind of made me perhaps appreciate that. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Depeche Mode, and I've recently been listening to their early stuff, and it wasn't just the introduction of synth music; it was the cleverness of the lyrics as well. I still saying something even back then, you know, and I think you just saying that's quite profound. Actually, made me think about that. But you were signed really young, weren't you? You were signed with a label from a very young age. Is that right?
Yeah, I was signed. I think my first deal was when I was 16. First single came out when I was 17, and I got 10 quid as an advance for that single. I don't think I made it back, actually, unfortunately. Yeah, I was a bit of a soul boy back then. It was on a independent soul label in London, and I had Judy Roberts, who was from a band called Working Week, who were kind of a jazz funk band actually at that time. She sang on the record with me. A couple of guys from Aswad on the record, and it all sounds like I must have been really in the know. I wasn't at all. I wasn't at all. There were no, you know, private doors opening for me. It was really by a lot of happenstance that I got into that situation. Being in music back then, we need to remember that this was way before even MySpace existed. You know, anything musically oriented in the digital sphere just wasn't there. So the idea of getting a record released, that the chances were very slim that you could do that. So when you got a record out, even if it didn't do well, it was a major milestone, a major achievement, because there was no way you could take your little cassette of demos and do anything with them except through a record label. That was the only avenue. So I remain appreciative to the guys who gave me that opportunity, because it was a door opener, definitely.
Yeah, you just saying that reminds me of another chap I interviewed, was Kenny Thomas, who you may well know, and you know, he told me that he had a few flops, for want of a better word, before a few of his records hit the big time. But he said it was such a valuable time for him. You know, it was almost like it was a good experience. It was a good learning curve, and to be patient. Did you find that yourself, or were you kind of just really frustrated that you'd not had a hit already?
Oh, both. There was frustration without a doubt, and plenty of times when I thought I was just going to give up. But no, the learning process you appreciate as you get older, and I think that I was lucky, because my dad would never give me hope unduly. He knew that if I was going to stand a chance in music, I really had to work hard. So he would compliment me when I had earned it. He wouldn't just say, for example, the current trend is, you know, you if you can dream it, you can do it. That's not the school that, you know, hardworking musicians come from. A lot of hardworking people who recognize that, no matter what their profession. But also I was taken under the wing of a very successful record producer called Mickey Most, who was at that time the most successful producer on the planet. He produced The Animals, The Yardbirds, Susie Quattro, Hot Chocolate, Donovan, Kim Wilde. You know, he was really, really successful, and he was a tough character. I don't know if any of your viewers will remember this, Alex, or if you remember it, but he was one of the judges on a talent show called New Faces.
I remember.
Which was the X Factor before the X Factor. And he was one of the ones that he was Simon Cowell, except he had earned his stripes. You know, he was the real deal. He wasn't just a TV personality. And he was like that off camera as well. He was tough to please. He was really cool with me, but he made me realize that I was going to have to reach further, higher, deeper, everything that I could if I was going to do it. So I always appreciated that, even though it was tough learning.
And what kind of things would he do then, Clark? What would he do that would push you to the max, which ultimately got the best sounds out of you?
I remember I had worked on a song at RAK Studios, which Mickey owned and still exists. He had RAK Studios in St John's Wood in London and RAK Records, and I was signed to RAK Records as a solo artist. And I'd worked on a track, and actually the engineer on that track was Mike, who is my compadre in Johnny Hates Jazz, and he was an engineer at the studios at the time. And Mickey walked past the studio, and I quickly popped my head out and said, you know, Mick, would you have a quick listen to this? So he came in, and he was quite an imposing character. He had kind of long permed hair and dark aviators and leathers and everything. And he was a bit of a rock star. And he listened to it. And at the end, he just started laughing. And I kind of went pale. And he spoke the words back to me. I'm not going to tell you what the words were, but it was supposed to be quite a political song. But as he spoke them back, he said, I like the riff in there, but that made me laugh. And he walked out, and it wasn't mean. It was actually very gentle. And it was more a question of saying, come on, man, you know, pull your bootstraps up, you know, you got to do this. And there was no kind of weird tirade or anything. No. It was very subtle what he did and what he said, but they were always things that made a difference.
Yeah, fascinating stuff, Clark. And I'd like to ask you about your relationship with Rusty Egan, who was a man who, well, he did such a lot, didn't he, for new sounds, I would say, new synth sounds, and was a real advocate for people, from what I've read in London particularly. Just tell us about Rusty and your relationship with him.
Have you spoken to Rusty, Alex, at all?
No, I'd like to get him on the Godcast, actually.
Rusty's great. I've kind of reconnected with Rusty recently, because we were very tight when I was a teenager, before Johnny Hates Jazz, before I got signed to RAK Records. And Rusty heard the first ever record I released, which was this kind of soul record called You Fooled Him Once Again. And he basically said, look, I'm going to work with you and we're going to help you create your own sound. Because as Rusty used to say, you know what, Clark, you're a superstar. The rest of the world doesn't know it. That's the issue. It was very kind of him. And he's very good at that. He instills a lot of confidence. So we worked a lot at Trident Studios in London, where Rusty was based. And, you know, of course, he'd been in the Rich Kids. He'd been in Visage. He was very much part of that Blitz Club world that, you know, Spandau came out of, Boy George came out of, and a lot more. And I was kind of on the, you know, I dipped my toes in that world. I was very fashion oriented because that was what was happening at the time. I was a kid of my time, and into electronica. And I'd gotten into electronica through a Thompson Twins record called Love on Your Side, which really was the one that kind of did it for me. So Rusty worked with me a lot, and eventually we kind of drifted apart, really. You know, I moved to the States and wrote for Warner Brothers over there for a while, then came back. And when I came back, I went with RAK Records. And then I saw Rusty years later at an 80s festival and got him on stage. You know, he was there actually DJing, because that's partly what he is. Not only, I got him on stage in front of this crowd of thousands, and I thanked him in front of everyone for being someone who gave me a lot of self-belief. And I'll never forget that. Ironically, I was due to sing lead on a Visage set in Belgium a couple of months ago, but because of the COVID situation, I wasn't able to go. I don't know whether they did it, but Rusty had asked me to fill, you know, Steve Strange's boots for a few songs, including Fated Grey, and I would have loved to have done it. It would have been a great thing to do. But yeah, Rusty has a whole story about how he's influenced contemporary music, and it would be worth listening to that story. Yeah. Yes,
I will certainly endeavour to get Rusty on. Johnny, something Clark, something I haven't touched on is your spiritual journey. Was religion in the Datchler household, or is this something that you contemplated in terms of music or anything like that?
Well, my mom was reasonably religious. My father wasn't particularly. I think my father was probably more political than religious, but that's not to say that I deduce from that one has to be one or the other at all. But my dad kind of spent more time in the political realm, and he was very, very left wing actually. And but I think, you know, I went to a school where we went to church every Sunday. We went to the school chapel every Sunday. So I was exposed to it, and, you know, had religious education classes every day. I think, though, that for me, I started to express my spirituality through music when I left Johnny Hates Jazz. And if anyone may be familiar with this, I did a live stream this year for 6 months called Journey Songs. And in Journey Songs, I picked a song every week that I've written and recorded myself. And I talked about the story behind the song, how I wrote it, why I wrote it, what the lyrics about, and then a bit more about the recording process, etc. And that goes into my solo work, which is, you know, not a lot of people know about. In the 90s, I had a whole journey, which was kind of unique. And it was kicked off with a single that came out after I left Johnny Hates Jazz, came out in 1990, called Crown of Thorns. And Crown of Thorns, and all of those recordings from that time are now available on an album called Journey Songs 1. So if anyone wants to check it out, it's not streamable yet. It'll be streamable early next year and out on CD. But Crown of Thorns really was an interesting one, in as much as I had read the book The Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis. And I thought that which was a book that had great reverence for Jesus, probably more so than the movie did, because it was a very big movie when it came out, a Scorsese movie called The Last Temptation. But what touched me was the concept that what if Jesus had just been a mortal man? What is the power of his message just coming from, that perspective? And I was very touched by this. So the song actually didn't end up being about the book at all. It just got me thinking. And it was really a song in many ways that was appreciative of Jesus, but critical of aspects of organized religion. And weirdly, I remember when I submitted the album to Virgin, there were other songs on there, environmental songs, there were love songs, but they heard Crown of Thorns and they said that should be the single. And I said to them, I'm really glad you said that, but you're mad. That's a bit of that's not what people are expecting. Is not exactly Careless Whisper. But for people who like my solo music and are aware of it, that's still one of the best songs for them. And then because I was very involved in the environmental movement, I think my spirituality turned more towards something that was earth oriented. And that's a whole story in and of itself. But I spent a lot of time in the 90s exploring my own spirituality and ended up learning with a Native American elder. And really that was, to a large extent, from the perspective of what can we do to change our attitude towards the planet. It wasn't about rejecting something, it was about embracing something new to me. So
there's kind of some quite popular Christian artists knocking around in the UK at the moment. A guy called Matt Redman, who you might be familiar with, who is kind of it's almost like contemporary pop Christian music. But do you enjoy listening to different genres, Clark? Is it something you enjoy exploring? What's your kind of flavors at the moment? What are you finding interesting?
Anything that's intelligent, I'll listen to, and that's quite pointed as a statement, because I think there's an awful lot of unintelligent music in the world at the moment, and part of the reason for that is that anyone can release anything these days. You can technically have released an album if it's on a streaming service, if it's on Spotify, and just by virtue of the fact it's there means you've released an album, but that doesn't say anything about how high or how low the bar is, the quality bar. And since the advent of streaming, all the way back to Napster and before, the bar has been kind of broken in two over someone's knee and thrown on the floor, as far as I'm concerned. So I'm really into music which is thoughtful and has something to say. I don't really care about the genre. If there's inquiry there, if there's questioning, searching of an intelligent nature in a way that affects us as humans, then I'm interested in it. As far as musically speaking, well, I'm going to sound really boring here and just say I really do like a good song. If it's got a great melody, I'm there. I mean, I grew up probably like you, Alex. I don't know, but I listened to everything. I wasn't tribal. A lot of us were tribal back then in our musical taste, but I never forget, I was really into the Sex Pistols. And eventually I became part of a band with Glenn Matlock, who was one of the original Sex Pistols. And Glenn got kicked out of the Pistols because he liked ABBA. Well, I loved ABBA as well as the Pistols, as well as Black Sabbath, as well as Stevie Wonder. I never saw a delineation there. It's just, it was great music. So I'm kind of still like that, really.
Yeah, me too. I was a bit tribal as a teenager, but I think that was just because I was a teenager, really. Clark, it'd be your fans would be furious if we didn't talk briefly about Johnny Hates Jazz, which is, I was wondering what success was like for you. Was it something you enjoyed, or did it come with its downfalls? What's your kind of reflections on the peak of Johnny Hates Jazz success when you were selling records all over the world?
I see it very differently now than I did then. and I would like to say, because I don't know if anyone is familiar with the story, which a lot of people probably are not anymore. I left at a very inopportune moment. We were #2 in charts in the States, and I bowed out. And part of the reason was I didn't like how we were being promoted. I felt we were being limited by being perceived as a kind of a smash hits band in the UK. We weren't really perceived that way in the rest of the world. And we did have, as you said, Alex, we had success all around the world pretty much simultaneously. So I should have been thicker skinned, but I wasn't. And I took the criticism that we did had, I really took it to heart. I think the irony is that I always felt that the people that I loved the most in music were people who had something to say, and also made great music along with that. And in a way, I think that that was where I wanted to head. I mean, our second hit was "I Don't Want to Be a Hero," which was an anti-war song, and I loved the fact that people would come up to you and they'd want to talk about it on the street. "Oh, I heard your record on the radio the other day. Really loved that. Is that what you're saying? You're saying, you know, is this got an anti-war stance, or, you know, why did you turn back the clock? Why did you feel that way about your past and all this kind of thing?" So I love that side of it, the people side of it. But there's no doubt that the only challenge about major successes is what it does to all of us internally and those around us. And if you're young and you don't have guidance, then that can become a difficult situation to be in. So actually, in some ways, me leaving was the right thing to do, because I didn't allow myself to go too far down that road.
And was it an acrimonious parting of the ways? Did it take a while to reconcile and restore relationships?
It did, yes. Yeah, I didn't speak to the other guys for over 20 years. And then there used to be 3 of us in the band. There's now actually only 2. And the guy who's still in the band with me, Mike, when we met in Cambridge in an Italian restaurant, having not spoken for 22 years. And I remember walking in, feeling really quite uncomfortable. What was this going to be like? And we sat down opposite each other, and Mike said to me, "Hey, Clark, how you doing?" He's from the States, by the way. That's my slight American accent there. He said, "Hey, how you doing?" And I said, "Fine, how are you?" And we just started talking, and it really was one of those moments, very cliche, where you feel like you'd seen him a week before. And so we just picked up from where we left off, and older, wiser. No, there's always baggage there, because you can't help but go through such an experience and be unaffected. But we're big enough people to move beyond it. So it's been really good.
And was there regret that it took 20 years?
No, not really, because let's remember one thing, that even if we'd wanted to rekindle something in the 90s was very, very unkind to the 80s musically. I didn't tell anyone I was in Johnny Hates Jazz in the 90s, and the other guys were the same. And it's not personal to Johnny Hates Jazz. It's a lot of bands who went through that. And so it wasn't until the 2000s when it all got reappraised, and electronic music became popular again, and people wanted to know where it came from, that suddenly you could stick your head above the parapet. And so it kind of happened at the right time. Yeah, it's fine.
And now you're back together. Is it more fun this time round?
Yeah, it is a lot more fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, youth really is wasted on the young, as far as I'm concerned. It's a lot of fun, because we have perspective now that comes with age. So
yeah,
you know, if either one of us takes something too seriously, the other one will have something to say about it, and we generally have a blast. We get on really well, and we still really love the process of making music. So I really wish I'd had this brain and this spirit when I was younger, because I would have handled myself differently. Definitely.
Yeah. And you talk about that reevaluation of the 80s. I was looking on your website, noticed that you're going on a delightful cruise with the Human League, who I went to see on Friday in Manchester with somebody else you'd mentioned, with Tom Bailey from the Thompson Twins. And I must tell you, I kind of have this theory. Well, I don't just really want to go for nostalgia. I want to go to listen to good music, and the quality of the music was really tip top. I was utterly impressed with both Tom Bailey and Phil Oakey. Just incredible night. And but and this whole 80s movement is just, it seems to be going from strength to strength. There's festivals all over the place, and there's a real passion to hear it all again, isn't there?
Yeah, and it's hard to know if that's going to fade with, as the audience who grew up with that music gets older. And obviously there's a 90s revival now, but from what I've heard, it doesn't equal the popularity of the 80s revival, because you've got a generation of young people who know that it all came from the 80s. That was that we were the synth generation. It's not that we were so special. We just, as I said, we had that interesting combination of circumstance of, classical songwriting and technology, and it all happened then. But it's an interesting one. You mentioned Human League, because when I first started performing with Johnny Hates Jazz in its second incarnation in the 2000s, I was not a big fan of Don't You Want Me. I really loved Love Action and the Lebanon, and I like the Human League a lot. But I remember at a festival when Don't You Want Me came on, and I stood and watched it and listened, and I thought, wow, that sounds absolutely brilliant. Yeah. So yeah, it's one of the great things about doing these festivals is listening to your peers and just reappreciating them, because back in the day, Alex, we were all horribly competitive with one another, quite petty. Yeah. And now that's kind of gone. Everyone just enjoys seeing each other, and yeah. Yeah.
And Clark, it's been wonderful talking to you, but I just wondered if you could offer some words of encouragement for young musicians. I went to the Tramlines Festival in Sheffield this year, and with the intent on listening to new music, and there is some fantastic bands, young bands out there. But I suppose in the 80s, if you sold a record, you could make a few quid, but there's not really that potential for these guys at the moment, is there? And what's your kind of best advice to these people who are making fabulous music, but maybe feel they're not being rewarded financially? Because I know that Spotify don't give anything, do they? There's not much money to be had. What would you say to these kids?
Well, the first thing I'd say is don't rush to release music. Make sure you get it right. And when I say get it right, if you don't have anyone in your life to guide you in that way, you've got to guide yourself there. And you've got to say, there's a real, I think, desire to just get things out there and get it heard and viewed. And I would say, just take your time there. It's better to release less than to release too much too quickly. I mean, an interesting example is a young artist called Orla Gartland. And if anyone wants to check her out, she's really taken her time. And by doing so, she's been noticed. So everything she does, she puts a little bit of extra effort into, and that's kind of working for her. She's still independent. Her streaming numbers are pretty good, whatever that means. I'm not really sure, to be honest. But I think the other thing is ask yourself a very simple question. Why do you want to do it? Because the world's in a really, really dreadful state right now. And if we need music to help us through it, at least to provide some kind of sense of direction, we need it now. And if we really are in an era where that's lacking, in chart music in particular. I need to say that, in chart music in particular. So I would think about that. Don't see music as over here as entertainment, and your political and spiritual views and psychological, philosophical views over here as something else, because we never did. From the 60s onwards, it was all part and parcel of the same thing. So I would say that really think about what you can do through the medium of music that will be of some benefit to the world. And I think you might find that that actually stands you in good stead with people finding you, rather than if you're just a fabulous musician with a fabulous voice. That's all great. That's wonderful. But I would say that search for your reasoning behind doing it, and then try and express it musically and lyrically.
Yeah. Thanks, Clark. And just to finish off, we're just a few weeks away from Christmas as we record this. Have you got a busy Christmas lined up, or are you intent on doing as little as possible? What's your plans?
Well, the live stream that I was doing, I'm doing a one-off on the 19th, Journey Songs Winter Solstice Special, I call it. It's the closest I could get to the solstice. Obviously couldn't get to Christmas because no one was going to be watching on that day. And that's going to be that's always fun. A lot of people join me live, and I perform a couple of songs acoustically live and talk a lot about the 2 songs I'm going to be dealing with then. So that's a big focus. I'm really working for this album Journey Songs 1 to come out. And I think more than anything for me, there's something about that period of time, you know, the solstice Christmas period of time, when as much as I will love to see family and friends and all the rest of it, I find it a very introspective time. And I think that I'm going to make sure I allow myself a few moments to be truly introspective and be in tune with the seasons, I think, because it's, you know, we're entering winter. It feels like winter already, doesn't it? And we're entering the depths of winter, and I kind of, it's a dreaming time in some ways. And so I'm going to be dreaming of how I'd like to see the coming year, not just for myself, but for the world. So I hope that doesn't sound glib, but that is going to be my focus this Christmas.
No, that sounds like a wonderful metaphor to describe Advent. So thank you. And Clark, thank you for your time. It's been fascinating talking to you, listening to your musical and spiritual journey. And we send our love to you from beautiful Burnley up in Lancashire. And just if people want to catch this winter solstice item, just tell people how to do that, Clark.
Yeah, if you want to join me for Journey Songs, it's on at 5 p.m. GMT, 5 p.m. UK time. And you can watch it on my Facebook page, Clark Datchler Official, or my YouTube page, Clark Datchler Official, youtube.com/Clark Datchler Official. And they're the best places to watch it, to be honest. And if you can get on there, starts at 5 o'clock. This one will probably last a good hour and a half, to be honest. Usually they last about an hour. And it's very, very interactive because the software I'm using enables people to message me in real time. So I'm talking to people as I do the stream, and it would be very festive. Very. Let me just say this: it's going to be quite. It's going to be the 19th, the 19th of December, which is a Sunday. 19th of December, Sunday, 5 p.m. UK time, on facebook.com/Clark Datchler Official. Or youtube.com/Clark Datchler Official.
Fabulous. Fabulous. Clark, thanks ever so much. And we send our love and best wishes to you from Lancashire. Thanks for coming on the Godcast. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's been a pleasure.